Good evening, everyone. This is Jose Nino for another episode of El Nino Speaks. And today I have a very special guest, Antonio Miranda. How are you today, Antonio?
Good evening, sir. Thank you for having me on. Greetings from beautiful San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's 83 degrees and cloudy right now. Very pleasant.
Yeah, pleasant indeed. Is San Juan, Puerto Rico is one of the more underrated spots in Latin America, and we met at a little informal political get together a few weeks ago, and I found your background to be quite captivating, especially given your knowledge and background living in Latin America. Could you give my audience just a really brief overview of your career trajectory?
No worries. I work in Puerto Rico. I'm a professional. I spent a lot of time in the States. I have relatives in the States. I went to university in the States. Spent most of my time in New York, like a lot of Puerto Ricans, and came back home a few years ago. And I find, that very few Americans understand Latin America, whether they say they're conservative, liberal, or anything else.
That was one thing that we touched upon during our private conversations. I think we came to an agreement that indeed most Americans don't really understand the region of Latin America. And what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that Americans across the political spectrum have about Latin America?
Well, I find that a lot of Americans really don't know a lot about the world. I think there's several reasons for that. Part of that's American exceptionalism. We're separated by two oceans. We have two much weaker countries. We have one to the north of us called Canada. We have one to the south of us called Mexico. We are separated by two oceans. Most Americans, I think only a third of the American people actually even have a passport. They can't even go to Niagara Falls, Canada. Plus, America is a very powerful country. People adopt American culture. They adopt American mores and ways of doing things. That's not necessarily the best thing, I would say. But if you want to talk about misconceptions, I think most people on the left see Latins as one big group that they can use as a bludgeon against the larger society. They're all part of this big, happy, multi-cult family. And I think that's a mistake. You're talking about 30 different countries. You're talking about people that are of European descent. You're talking about mestizos. You're talking about mulattoes. You're talking about Amerindian people, very different cultures. Some of the countries are very European, particularly Uruguay and Argentina. They're very European. Some of them are very indigenous, like Ecuador and Peru. So you get different cultures. You have indigenous languages that are spoken quite extensively, such as Quechua in Peru and Ecuador. In Paraguay, the Guarani language is a second official language with Spanish. Of course, Brazil is its own world, not technically Hispanic, but it was settled by the Portuguese. So you have a lot of different groups, and I think a lot of leftists see Hispanics as just part of the big coalition that they can use. And I don't think that's accurate. And as far as conservatives, you want to say Conservative Inc. or whatever, they see Hispanics as, quote, natural conservatives. And it's just not that simple. So I think most groups, most people in the American spectrum, political spectrum, cultural spectrum, have very little understanding of Latin America.
I really liked your point that you made up about the multicultural thing with regards to liberals, because as you correctly pointed out, Latin America, like the term Hispanic, that's just not a very accurate term. And it honestly, in my opinion, needs to be retired because it's not very specific. And you're dealing with a broad spectrum of ethno-linguistic groups that are quite multiracial in nature. You could go, like you mentioned, Peru, it being indigenous. You can even find Japanese Peruvians there. And then you can go to Argentina, where you will find Argentines of Greek, Armenian, French, German, Italian, and Italian descent. So you have like a whole spectrum of people. And then, yeah, you go to Mexico and Central America, you'll see mestizos, and in Central America, more Indians. So these type of groups, historically, it is true that certain Latin American groups have traditionally voted Democrat, but it's not monolithic, like say the black vote, where it's like an 80 to 90% vote. It's based on what I've studied, it can go anywhere like 60-40 in favor of Democrats, or sometimes 70-30, but it's changed now in the populist era, where I think because of like the rise of like so-called Trumpism and just populist politics on the right, I think Latin Americans are more likely to gravitate towards that, because a good deal of so-called Hispanic voters, they're starting to identify more with the white culture, especially as the politics becomes more woke. It creates like a strange black-white dichotomy, and as a result, Hispanics start identifying more with the white, and also they're just against a lot of these radical LGBT body positivity stuff that's like antithetical to Latin American norms and mores. And I think we're in like a different era where Hispanic voters, they're starting to get a new identity in the United States, and we're in for a really interesting political experiment. But I'm just curious here, have you lived in any other Latin American countries outside of Puerto Rico areas like that?
I have not. I have not. And look, you make a good point. You talk about the word Hispanic. That is an artificial creation by the United States government. It is an artificial creation. And again, you're talking about people that are completely European, all the way to Amerindian, mulatto, black, and of course, depending on the country. But to answer your question, I have not. And what holds this together, and it's very different than Anglo culture in North America, is what holds us all together is the Spanish language and culture, and people want to assimilate to that. I think leftists would be very disappointed. Latin culture is not woke. It is not LGBTQ friendly. It is not a vegan culture. It is not a feminist culture. And if they think these people are good, and that's why you're seeing people, you're seeing Latin people in the States turn away from the Democrats. They don't have a lot in common with that. They don't sympathize with that. And I think to some degree, they see the National Democratic Party as the black party, and they don't want to be associated with that. And you mentioned, they want to be white if they can. And they certainly want to assimilate that. And you go to a place like Texas, you have Tex-Mex people that were there before statehood. And they tend to be very conservative. There was a congressman there named Henry Bonilla, who was very good on the border. He was solid on the border, as you or me would be. And the Mexicans in California tend to be less assimilated. They tend to be more to the left, but it depends on where you go. Cubans they vote 9-1 Republican. Puerto Ricans in New York tend to vote 9-1 Democrat. But on the island, you have two very strong parties affiliated with the Republicans and the Democrats. You have a Puerto Rican Independence Party that's very, very small, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But the model, what happened in Latin America, their history is different. It is not a model for the United States. The English tended to bring women with them. They created settler societies. The Spanish did not do that. So they intermarried with the Amerindian people, or whoever was close to them. And at one time, during the colonial era, the Spanish had 16 words for race and ethnicity. But again, Latin, I have never, I'd say almost never had another Puerto Rican give me a hard time for my political views. It is always Anglo white liberals. I've had very few Hispanics ever give me a problem about my views.
Yeah, Hispanic cultures, in my opinion, whenever you talk about anything controversial about race, sex or even like the Jewish question, stuff like that, people don't get offended because those cultures, like political, like being politically incorrect is very much ingrained in your DNA there. For example, it's very normal for among friends to have like someone nicknamed negro, like negro, or gordo, like fat ass, or somebody like that. People have that kind of like joking nature, and they don't really get their panties in a bunch over like trivial stuff or talking about subject matters that are really controversial. Yeah, I want to talk though about Puerto Rico's politics, because that's where I found it to be pretty fascinating about the political landscape there. Just give the audience a brief overview about that.
Well, you have Puerto Rico. To touch on that just a little bit, Puerto Rico was discovered in Columbus's second voyage to the New World in 1493. It was inhabited by the Taino Indians. That was the indigenous population. There are none of those people left. They were absorbed by the Spanish. The Taino Indians also were in Cuba. And you got to remember, Jose, this was a period of wide European exploration. Not only the Spanish, but the English, the French, the Portuguese. If you were able to do it, they did it. The Europeans had discovered the use of the sextant and the compass, so they were able to navigate across the ocean successfully and make it back. But, right after the time of Columbus, within 50 years, the Europeans had circumnavigated the globe, and they had conquered almost all of Latin America. I know you're familiar with Hernan Cortez. In 1516, he landed at Cozumel, and between 1519 and 1521, overthrew a very large, powerful empire. The Aztecs around what's now Mexico City. How did he do that? 300 men, horses, and gunpowder is not enough to conquer a whole nation. But the other Indians got tired of their hearts being cut out by the Aztecs, so they helped the Spanish. There's a very good book you might be familiar with called The History of New Spain by a man named Bernal Diaz, and it covers the conquest of Mexico and what happened with the Aztecs. But we mentioned Cortez. 1519, Ponce de Leon had explored Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. In between 1519, 1522, Magellan circumnavigated the globe, and this is 30 years after Columbus. Most of those men did not make it back to Spain, but there's a group that did, and they lived to tell and write about it. About Francisco Pizarro in Peru conquered the Incas around 1531, 1532. The Incas were relatively advanced along with the Aztecs, but the interesting thing is the Incas did not have the wheel. They used it for toys for their children. And of course, they didn't have horses. There were no horses in the New World, so the conquistadores brought them. And of course, the Spanish established the first permanent settlement in the Americas in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. Particularly about Puerto Rican and Cuba. Of course, Puerto Rico and Cuba were the last Spanish colonies in the New World. 1898, the Spanish-American War, the 118-day splendid little war that William Randolph Hearst and the papers propagated and promoted. Cuba became independent, but the Platt Amendment in 1902 made Cuba an American protectorate. That law was not rescinded till 1934. The United States acquired Guantanamo Bay as a result of the Platt Amendment, and the American military is still there against the will of the Cuban government. Now, as far as Puerto Rico goes, the United States Army controlled Puerto Rico until 1900, and the Four-Acre Act established civil government. The Jones Act in 1917 made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. You are probably familiar with the 1950 attack on the Blair House. The White House was being refurbished and restored. President Truman was at the Blair House across the street from the White House, and a group of Puerto Rican terrorists attacked the Blair House. And Some of those men were killed. Some of them served long prison terms, and they were pardoned years later. But there was an undercurrent of a Puerto Rican terrorist movement that is pretty much gone now. The present Commonwealth status that established the Estado Libre Asociado was passed by Congress and the Puerto Rican legislature in 1952. Now, as far as current Puerto Rican politics, you have two major parties affiliated with the U.S. political parties, and you have a Puerto Rican Independence Party. The Partido Nuevo Progresista, the NPP, is a pro-statehood party. You can look at their website. It's in Spanish. If you don't know Spanish, you can look at Google Translate. It's right on their website. They push for Puerto Rican statehood. They control most of the Puerto Rican Senate, Puerto Rican House, and the local municipalities. There is the Partido Popular Democrático, which is pro-Commonwealth. They're affiliated with the Democratic Party here in the States. They are a minority party on the island, but they are very competitive. More importantly, they hold the non-voting congressional seat. This person is called the resident commissioner, and he is a member of that party. There is also a smaller party, much smaller party, called the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño, the PIP, and they are very small. They've never drawn more than about 10% of the vote. In the last Puerto Rican elections, they drew 2% of the vote island-wide. My impression of them, and I know people in the PIP, they tend to be very intellectual. They're very cerebral. They have never been able to reach out to the masses in Puerto Rico.
I've noticed this over the years of studying international affairs and just looking at things going on in other countries abroad. Has there been any presence of NGOs or any organizations that export woke politics or cultural tropes into Puerto Rico, and has that stuff gradually seeped into the broader culture?
I am not aware of that offhand, to be honest with you. The big debate, the pro-Commonwealth people, they're afraid of statehood. They're afraid they will lose their culture. They are afraid, there's already enough Americanization in Puerto Rico. They want to keep their unique culture. The NPP, the pro-statehood people, say that would not be a big issue. The United States has dealt with Latin people for a long time, and that would not occur. The PIP is more the independent Puerto Rican Independence Party. You can think of them like being the popular Democrats on steroids. But as far as NGOs, I'm not aware of any offhand. Puerto Ricans they're American citizens. They get some benefits of citizenship, but of course, they don't vote for president. They vote in the primaries, but they do not pay federal tax either. And of course, they can come and go as they please to the mainland. The very large Puerto Rican communities in New York, that's the first place that most of them went. The big mass migration post-World War II. My father came to the States the first time in the late 1940s as a teenager. At that time, it's kind of like the West Side Story generation, kind of a romanticized Shakespearean version of that. But no, the big issues, I think, in Puerto Rican politics revolve around statehood versus Commonwealth. They've had problems in their government a few years ago. They were not able to, the State Department came in and took over issuing passports because you had other Latins coming in and faking their birth certificates. They've had financial crises over the years. So Puerto Rico has a lot of I don't think statehood is going to happen anytime soon, nor do I think independence is going to happen anytime soon.
Why do you think those scenarios will not happen anytime soon?
Well, first of all, Congress would have to allow them to become a state. And I don't think that the GOP officially supports Puerto Rican statehood in its platform. But I think once you get away from the Beltway and the establishment Republican Party, I don't think there's a lot of support for it, to be honest with you. I think a lot of Democrats want it because they think they would get 6 Democrat members of the House and 2 Democrat senators. But now, for some of the reasons I just stated, I don't think Congress is going to admit them. Nor do I think, because some of the problems I mentioned, nor do I think the people on the island, there's never been a clear majority. There was a plebiscite, there was a non-binding plebiscite a few years ago, 2014, 2015. But there was very, very low turnout, and the popular Democrats encouraged their people to boycott that, which they did. And the Puerto Rican independence people boycotted that. But you've never had a overwhelming support for Puerto Rican statehood, either on the island or in the U.S. Congress.
I see. Hypothetically speaking, if Puerto Rico were to become a state, would it be a safe Democrat state, or would it be more of like a swing state?
I hope it wouldn't be I hope it would not be a secure blue state like California or Washington, D.C. or whatever. I know D.C. is not a state, of course, but they have 3 electors and they always vote Democrat very overwhelmingly. The people that support, I have contacts, pro-statehood people, and they don't believe that would be the case, but I don't know.
Interesting. As it stands now, and I don't know if you have the statistics offhand, what are the racial demographics of Puerto Rico?
Now, that's a good question. I've got a pretty good grasp of that. About 70% of the people in Puerto Rico consider themselves white. They would not be white by North American standards. It would be a much smaller number. But again, as we've discussed, there's more of a color continuum in Latin America than there's no hard and fast color line like in the States. And of course, you will see Hispanics intermarry with Anglos. It's much more common than black-white marriages. And I can tell you something else, and I deal with a lot of Hispanics, and I've dealt with a lot of non-Puerto Ricans in the States, and I just don't have not experienced the hostility that you see. It's not like when whites deal with black Americans, you're kind of walking on eggshells, I think. There's a lot of distrust. The reason you see 70% of Puerto Ricans consider themselves white is that's how they see themselves. And again, the Spanish culture is the norm. It is a European Christian Catholic culture. And that's what they aspire to. That's what they want. As you would well know, Jose, in Latin America, if you look at a Mexican soap opera, you would think some Klan guy was doing the casting because they're all Spanish Mexicans. And there's a much smaller percentage of European-derived people, maybe 15, 20% in Mexico. Most of them are mestizos. About a third of them are Amerindians, particularly in the south of Mexico, around Chiapas and that part of Mexico. But that's, if you're upper class in Latin America, you remember Chavez in Venezuela, you marry someone lighter than yourselves. Alan Wall has written, and Steve Saylor has written quite a bit about that concept. In fact, Alan Wall is married to a Mexican lady, spends a lot of time there. His children are bilingual. He's in the Texas National Guard. It is not the same dynamic as you see between black and white Americans. I think Hispanics are much more assimilable to the larger culture. What I don't like is where the woke left, and you see the American government that encourages them not to assimilate and not to adapt to this country.
Yes, I've you mentioned Steve Saylor. I like a lot of his writings with regards to multiracial dynamics in the US. And he said like one very pragmatic reform to assimilate large swaths of the current Hispanic population in the United States is to get rid of like the Hispanic category altogether. And I actually agree with that because it makes it much easier for people like that are Hispanic that are like want to be like aspirationally white to just identify with that culture, which they're already starting to kind of do. I saw actually a study yesterday that Hispanics that de-identify, quote unquote, that basically no longer identify as Hispanic, but identify like as white or another racial category, they tend to be more centrist or right wing in the U.S.
Well, the term is called your castizo future. And a lot of people, Mark Uray has written about that. And he uses there was an article a few years ago where he talks about the rim of South America, particularly Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. And of course, those are particularly Argentina and Uruguay, very European countries. Chile, a little bit lesser degree, but you don't have. You're right. Not only did you have Spanish people there, you had a lot of Italians, a lot of English, a lot of Croatians, a lot of Germans. I knew a guy in the United States Army that was with the Argentine military attaché's office on the post, and his last name was Macaulay. His grandfather was an Irishman, but he was an Argentinian. So that is not unusual. And I'll give you another example, and this is anecdotal, of course, but I had a friend in the States from New Mexico, and he said, my ancestors have been in New Mexico since the 16th century. So we were Mexican for 20 years after Mexican independence in 1823, and then there was the Mexican War a little over 20 years later. And those people are very, very assimilated. And again, Texas, particularly Texas, very, very assimilated people.
Yes. Actually, one thing about some of the people like in Texas, like the so-called Tejanos we talked about before, they've historically have been a Democrat constituency. They have a lot more in common with like a West Virginia or a Kentucky ancestral Democrat that has flipped over to the Republican Party. It's part of like these kind of like downwardly mobile type of working class white groups. Whereas like the Tejanos, they're kind of like more castizo, mestizo, if you will, but they have like a similar economic profile and they're very hostile towards mass migration. In fact, one of the biggest myths, in my opinion, that liberals have about Hispanics is that they only care about immigration, which is actually not really true. And there is increasing polling that I've seen in recent elections that show that immigration is not even like the top 5 issues that many Hispanic voters care about, especially for Hispanics that have been in the U.S. for more than 4 or 5 generations.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. And again, they don't identify with LGBTQ. They don't identify with wokeness. They don't identify with the left luxury belief, hot button issues, things that, at one time, Democrats were purported to care for the working class and to help people go to college and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party is affiliated. You have upper middle class suburban people, and you have minorities, depending on where you're, particularly California, and a large section of at least a plurality of the Hispanic population, depending on where you are, and government workers, people like that, but your average, you're exactly right. I'm familiar with the polls you're talking about. As far as immigration, that's in the top, maybe top. That's not even the top five. More interested, and you're right. I mean, my gosh, you've got a working class guy that's working really hard, following the rules. Once his kids go to college, speaks perfect English, speaks Spanish, of course, but speaks English. And he doesn't want his wages undercut by an illegal immigrant. That's a very good point.
Yeah, actually, one thing too, it's funny because I grew up mostly in Texas, and you go to any street in like a major city in Texas, you'll have one that is named after Cesar Chavez. And it's pretty amusing because he's been retconned as like a kind of like leftist civil rights hero. And he is a old school labor leftist, but he was quite hostile to illegal immigration that put downward pressure on worker wages, obviously, because it's basic economics. It's rather curious how his legacy has been memory hold, or at least retcon to serve a present agenda.
Well, I agree with you. He had some problems in his personal life, but as far as what he did for these farm workers, he was against the illegals because it did drive down wages, and it hurt the people that he represented. And I give him credit for that. And I'll tell you something what I think. I think you'll agree with this, Jose. A lot of ordinary blacks on the street aren't particularly crazy about illegal immigration either, because they're working class. It hurts their wages, but they're betrayed by their leaders. Just like you have, it used to be called La Raza. It's Unidos now, the group, and it's kind of like what is the successor to La Raza, and they are open borders people. But there's a big difference between the educated upper middle class Hispanics and blacks and the man on the street that actually has to live with it. You have a professional person. You have a person with an upper middle class job. Their wages are never going to be undercut.
Yeah, 100%. There's a big time class distinction. I've noticed that the biggest open borders boosters among Hispanics tend to be of the professional managerial class or higher. And there's always some type of Jewish connection too, because one big difference between Latin America, both like in terms of the political and economic structure, is that it's much less Judaized than the United States in terms of the levels of Jewish influence and the way that Jewish groups use minorities and non-whites as golems to undermine the social fabric of their respective countries.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but and the JQ is something I think we should deal with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. There are, of course, Jews on our side. Paul Gottfried is great. Chronicles Magazine writes a lot of great articles. We would agree with him on most things, but I do think you're right. A lot of the organized, very large, influential Jewish groups, they like mass immigration because they think it helps them, that a multi-cult Babylon will help them. They don't want to live in a minority neighborhood, just like most upper middle class whites. I think that's just a fact. And something else in Latin culture you do not have. This is not a cultural influence, but in the United States, with Christian Zionism, evangelical Christians, of course, are big, influential supporters of Israel. And you have that due to the theology called dispensationalism. And just a very brief overview of that. But that was developed by a man named John Nelson Darby in the 1830s, who was an Irishman. He was from the Church of Ireland. He eventually founded a Protestant denomination called the Plymouth Brethren. He is the one that systemized dispensationalism, and you can look it up. It was popularized in the United States in the late 19th century with the Bible College movement. And there's a lot of those Bible College, Philadelphia College of the Bible, Moody Bible Institute. There was Biola in Los Angeles, and they're almost all dispensational. And the Scofield Reference Bible, which the first edition was published in 1909, gave a systematic, laid it out very systematically. If you ever see a Scofield, you can download the first copy from archive.org. It's not copyrighted. It's from 1909. Many different revisions since then, but it lays out dispensationalism, explains it. And you must understand that no Christian in the world believed in dispensationalism before that period. Certainly not the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodoxy, and neither did Martin Luther, John Calvin, or Zwingli, or Erasmus, or any of those people associated with the Protestant Reformation. They believed what the Catholic Church believed about the church in national Israel. So Christian Zionism and dispensationalism has been a very big influence in our culture, and it has a real world effect. To give you a quick example, in Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a theological argument. They believe that the Holy Spirit proceeds from God the Father alone. In the Western Church, the church teaches the Holy Spirit proceeds from God the Father and God the Son. Now, which one of those I believe, that doesn't affect American foreign policy. It doesn't affect the countries we support or give financial aid to. But because of Christian Zionism and dispensationalism, it has a very, very large effect. And these people support Israel for theological reasons, not political or strategic reasons or anything else. I don't think that we get a lot from it as far as strategically. It gets us involved in the Middle East in ways we don't need to be. But if I believe that, if my God is telling me to believe that theology, that doesn't matter. So, you see it much less. Well, you don't really see it among Latin people. There are some evangelicals now, and particularly in Guatemala, there's some evangelicals now in Latin America, and that's changing somewhat. But it is not Puritan influenced. It is not was it Cromwell? Cromwell had a big admiration of the Jews. He let them back in England after they had been expelled in 1290. And this is even before dispensationalism, but there was always been a part of Anglo culture that had great admiration for the Jews. And then, of course, you add dispensationalism to that. It's no wonder that regardless of political party, whether you're Republican, you're Democrat, they're going to be pro-Israel. Democrats tend to be less, particularly younger evangelicals, that is an interesting turn, by the way. Evangelicals under 30 are much less pro-Israel. But again, I do not think that is a question we should be obsessed with. I think there's a lot more low-hanging fruit that we can deal with, such as crimes, such as interracial crimes, such as illegal immigration, the national debt. Our culture is degenerate to a very large degree, and we export that around the world. I could see where someone from a traditional culture, a Muslim culture, or a Latin culture would not be particularly crazy about adopting American mores and values.
Another point that we were discussing, just like in some of our correspondence before the show, that you had a critique of conservatives with regards to Latin America, how they ignore certain facets of U.S. interventions in the region. What particularly annoys you about that?
Well, I think most Americans believe, Henry Kissinger says in the book Diplomacy that an American is absolutely incapable of seeing themselves as others see us. And I think that is true. Of course, Henry Kissinger was an immigrant, left Nazi Germany, his family in 1933 when he was just a boy. And Kissinger was a brilliant theorist, brilliant writer, even before he got involved in government. But the book Diplomacy is well worth your read. It's a little dated, It's from about 30 years ago, but it is an excellent read. That being said, I think most Americans believe the American way of life is superior, and it is our job, our duty to give it to the rest of the world. Now, we're talking about Latin America in particular. Of course, most of Latin America became independent. The wars of independence were led from around 1810 to about 1830 by Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. And all of these countries pretty much became independent, except Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last two Spanish colonies. There's still some European-held small islands in the Caribbean. Guyana became independent from Britain as the only English colony in South America in 1966. Belize was 1981. That's an English-speaking country in Central America, but most of those countries were independent very early on. President, you're familiar, I know, with the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, that the United States would not allow intervention in the Western Hemisphere, new intervention by Europe. And so the United States, even before post-World War II internationalism, has had a big role, a big influence in Latin America. I think with a mixed bag, I think it's caused a certain resentment. And I think your average American has very little awareness of that.
Yes, 100%. There is a general kind of, and I think this goes back to your point about there is like a general like ignorance of like foreign affairs, especially of those of our backyards. And there's some degree of like need for like having like strategic empathy and so-called geopolitical empathy of how people view, how foreign people view like the U.S. and all of that. But like I think the conversation has to first start about like what Latin American cultures are, what differences they have, and also what similarities and ways we can actually bond with them. But I think this is a good place to wrap things up, Antonio. And before we leave, if you have any final message or anything to plug, go ahead.
I would encourage people to get informed. I would encourage people to read different websites, listen to different podcasts. I discovered yours fairly recently, and I listen every week. And you've had some great interviews. I can tell you with this, the mainstream media just does not have the same influence that it did, before in the pre-internet era. The pre-cable TV era. I remember when you had three networks and you had Walter Cronkite, you had John Chancellor on NBC, Cronkite on CBS, and Harry Reasoner on ABC. And those days are gone. I don't think anyone could tell you or even cares who the main newscaster is on the NBC Nightly News. So I would encourage people just to be informed and to think outside the box and to put yourself in the other party's shoes and try to see how they view things.
That's great, man. I find your insights to always be outside the box, and you do get people thinking. And I hope that more people start talking about Latin America because of the simple fact that it is going to become a region that will become more important as the U.S. like adopts like this new neo-Monroe Doctrine type of approach and starts focusing more on Latin American affairs. But until then, thank you again for coming on to the show, and also to the audience, thank you for your attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.